Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to a new series of Bin of Words, which I'm going to call Spotlight. In this, I'm going to invite people who are actually working in the area of homelessness or other areas. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Matt Downey, who is CEO of Crisis. So welcome, Matt. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for having me, Ian. Good to be here.
I've got a simple question to start with. What is a CEO and what does your job entail?
It's a good question. I've been doing it for 4 months and I'm still learning. So if you ask me in another 4 months, it might be slightly different. But largely speaking, the job is work out what the vision and objectives of the organisation should be, make sure that that's clear to everyone, be absolutely consistent and clear with staff and with supporters about what we want the organisation to achieve. And then make sure that things are well run so that our finances are in order, so that kind of all the things that we worry about and that trustees worry about, they don't have to worry about too much. But also to be a spokesperson for the organisation and for the cause and be in many ways the sort of lead lobbyist, lead fundraiser, lead kind of thanker of supporters and things like that. So it's those sorts of things. But as I say, I'm learning the job.
Yeah, I've known you for a number of years. And I'm going to ask, this is a question, and this goes to my acting training. Why do you do it?
Why do I do it?
Yeah.
Well, I've always worked in the charity sector. And so the sort of, the first part of that question is probably answerable by saying that I really like the idea of getting paid to do stuff I'm passionate about. And I'm passionate about a few causes, and I've worked in autism, I've worked in homelessness, and I've worked in child protection, and I care about all three of those. When I came to Crisis about 7 years ago, though, I discovered an organisation that, frankly, I sort of fell for, where I could see that the way in which people who face homelessness can be treated, either for good or ill, really matters. And discovered an organisation, and it's not alone. There are lots of other really good organisations, but I discovered at Crisis that treating people with equality and dignity runs through the heart of the response of this organisation. And I thought, well, if we can match that with being quite ruthless and organised in terms of our lobbying efforts, then we could really have a special organisational model that I want to be part of. So I've been sat there for 7 years wanting this job because it's like not in a sort of Machiavellian way, but just because I think this organisation is very special, and there are things I'd like to do with it to really make a dent in homelessness, because I don't feel any sense of cynicism or fatalism about it. I feel frustration that kind of, as yet, society hasn't been organised around solving it. And I think that's totally achievable.
That's a later question I'm going to ask you. So for my viewers who do not know what Crisis is, can you tell us what Crisis is?
Yeah, sure. So Crisis has been around for 55 years now. And it started off really as a sort of Christmas fundraising and kind of awareness raising operation. And that heritage of doing something at Christmas survives to this day. But now what it is basically is it's a collection of services, so 11 of what we call skylight services up and down the country in England, Scotland and Wales, of kind of research and policy and campaigning work that is super important to us, because basically there's still a two-tier system on homelessness. There are some people that qualify for help, some people that don't. And the list of people that don't and the reasons that they don't are still outrageous. It's still completely bafflingly inhumane. So that's a big part of what we do. But we're also, I mean, it's quite a big organisation now. We have about 800 staff, so that includes needing to have quite a lot of professional sort of operations behind the scenes. So, you know, a good fundraising operation, you know, all the things that a good, modern, progressive, forward-looking organisation needs, like a, you know, a marketing team and things like that. So, yeah, it's a variety of things, although I think at its heart, it's still always been the same thing, which is meeting the immediate need of people who are homeless today, but also not stopping there and thinking, well, how are we going to solve this in the long term and persuade politicians to do the right thing?
Yeah, we've spoken about this in other. I've been to that panel I got on. You've spoken about it there, which is interesting because I remember. The question is, and the question I'm going to ask you, because remember the government have said by the end of the parliament, which is only a couple of years off, they're going to end street homelessness. Do you still think that's possible?
I don't think it's possible with the strategy they've got, but I do think ending street homelessness is possible. So there are a couple of reasons why I think it's absolutely possible. One is because I've seen it. I've been to Finland. I've seen it, and I know how they did it there. The other reason is that actually there is some of the longer term causes of wider homelessness cannot be dealt with in the sort of short term. You know, we're not going to undo the kind of chronic housing shortages in the next 2 years. But street homelessness is still relatively small in this country. It really is only London that has, levels of street homelessness that equate to other places around the world. Most other cities, it's really quite small. Like Birmingham's only 50 or 60 people, and that, I mean, quite frankly, it's now ridiculous that some of those cities still have any at all. And I saw over the pandemic that rough sleeping in Glasgow, for example, went down to single figures. You know, this stuff can be done. But the strategy that the government has isn't particularly to understand the most effective solutions or the most effective preventative measures. I think they're still putting a lot of money into temporary and emergency accommodation. And you and I both know, Ian, that that's not the way to deal with any individual's kind of long-term prospects. And quite often people will cycle in and out of those sorts of forms of accommodation back onto the streets. Quite often some of that emergency accommodation could be really awful. And I have met people, and I know you have as well, where they make a choice that actually the conditions of some of these places are not safe, they're not clean, they're not healthy, and that, you know, I was speaking to someone recently who said that he takes a holiday from his hostel by sleeping on the streets from, you know, 1 or 2 days a month, and so there's sort of that basic kind of shift from managing homelessness through accommodation projects to ending it through actual housing and support hasn't been made yet.
Now in Finland, they've got something called Housing First, wasn't it? Am I correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And maybe you explain Housing First. Do you believe that's the way to go? But also explain what it is, maybe.
Yeah. So Housing First is really is a change in philosophy on homelessness, to say that instead of having to prove that you're deserving of or clean and sane and sober enough for some form of housing and being, you know, asked to spend periods of weeks or months or years in temporary accommodation first, that you turn that on its head and you say, right, well, all of us can deal with our problems much better as soon as we've got some of our own to live. So the Housing First approach in Finland has led to the systematic close down of all of their hostels and night shelters, bar one. So there's one emergency night shelter left in that country, and it's in the centre of Helsinki. And I've been there, and it's constituted of mostly it's constituted of small independent flats that are nicer than where I live in North London. So even that is dignified and a high quality. Anyway, so this idea of saying, well, homelessness is a supply issue, so that we need enough housing so that when it does happen to people, they go straight to their own home, and a support issue by saying, well, actually the best way of delivering support is to people in their own home rather than trying to muddle through in a mass kind of accommodation setting. That's the thing that's broken in the back of homelessness in Finland. And so Housing First is a program that over here is applied to people with complex needs, as it's called. I don't really like that term, but that's how it's applied. But in Finland, it's applied to everyone. Basically, the question is, do you need somewhere else to live? If yes, here it is. Do you need some support to stay there? If yes, here that is. And when we sort of break down the sort of over complexity of homelessness to just those two questions, you realize that you can move from managing it to ending it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Now, I want to talk about some of the policies you've been trying to put through. Let's start with the Vagrancy Act, which is really, I know we've been discussing some of the things I have. How do you feel about, first of all, maybe explain to our viewers what the Vagrancy Act is, and then your approach to it.
Yeah, so the Vagrancy Act dates back to 1824, and back then the government of the time they wanted to do something about all the servicemen who had come back from the Napoleonic Wars and were cluttering up the streets with their limbs hanging off and all of that stuff. And so they passed the Vagrancy Act to deal with the language that was used was to deal with rogues and vagabonds. That's how people were described. And what it did is it made a criminal offence of homelessness and begging. And up until 2022, that has still stood. So in England and Wales, it's still been a criminal offence to have nowhere to live. So in many ways, it's, because prosecutions of people under the Vagrancy Act, they're not thousands and thousands and thousands. It's only a handful of people every year that were prosecuted for the rough sleeping offence, although probably about 2,000 a year for begging. In many ways, although that's small scale, the big problem with it is that it's symbolic of attitudes towards homelessness and poverty more generally. And the word, if you autocorrect homelessness on some, Microsoft products, for example, the autocorrect word is still vagrant. It's still deep-seated, this attitude that people have caused their own problems, that they're somehow deficient as human beings and subhuman, and therefore can and should be persecuted for the situation they find themselves in. So in many ways, the repeal of the Vagrancy Act is the culmination, actually, of a much longer fight than this particular kind of bit of lobbying that we've been doing, a much longer fight to achieve a sense of equality for people and remove this underclass kind of label that's been applied. So we've been working on this for the last 3 years or so to basically get rid of it, and really pleased to say that it's gone. The government have finally agreed to abolish the Vagrancy Act.
What about, because I know the replacements, the rumoured replacements, like I believe the Policing Act is going to be reinforced. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, so the old 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or even 1 step forward, 2 steps back applies to this, because the crime of rough sleeping is gone, and that won't come back. But in the middle of a political kind of environment at the moment, where what the government is trying to do is bring in quite a lot of draconian police measures, what they also decided to do is try and put back some of the anti-begging measures. And, in the process of the last 3 years, we did have to concede that actually sometimes the police don't know what to do when it comes to begging that causes distress and alarm, where there's kind of antisocial behaviour or elements or suspicion of harassment or quite chronic self-neglect and really tricky issues like that. So we said, there probably is a role for some form of joined up police response together with support services in those quite rare circumstances, but that criminalising the act of begging itself is tantamount to just anti-poverty kind of stuff that, the sort of stuff that we were talking about just now. So we are fighting again. We're fighting a campaign for them to strip out the sort of nonsense that they're proposing to do in the Levelling Up Bill, which is the legal vehicle they're going to try and use for this stuff. I don't know how we'll get on because, what the government feel is that they have compromised and that they've agreed to get rid of the Vagrant Act, but that, in its place they will show their kind of their mettle when it comes to being tough on crime by making sure that begging itself is still seen as a criminal offence. So, yeah, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, definitely.
Let's say I want to talk about the police, because as you know, I'm an ex-rough sleeper myself.
Yeah.
And I remember I used to sleep on the doorstep regularly, but you don't own the spot. I came back one night, somebody was sleeping there, so I looked for somewhere else. I ended up sleeping on a church just off Oban Viaduct. Their doorstep, where a few people were there. And about 7:30, all of a sudden, there's a police station around the corner. The police appeared and said, "You have to go." And actually, at that point, the warden came out of the church and said they have our permission to stay here. Which not a lot of people know about it. Do you think the police need training in how to deal with homeless people?
Yeah, definitely I do. And it's been really interesting getting to know different responses from the police, actually. So from the worst cases of quite poor kind of almost bullying culture I've seen in some cases where the police are actively out to sort of, sort of seem like they're out to abuse their own powers, to the most thoughtful, almost like social work approaches from some police. So, for example, I was up in Manchester, and there's an officer called Warren up there, and he's just a hero. This guy, because what he does is he gets to know people, and he gets to know what they need, and he will pick people up, but not to arrest them, but to take them to the services they need, and he'll stay with them, and he'll build partnerships with the people that might need scripting or the people that might need access to benefits or whatever. So, so we produced a guide for police on exactly this, sort of demonstrating all of the good stuff that's out there. But this isn't over. To a large extent, it's to do with the culture of what police is for. And some people think that being in the police is all about finding people to punish and then punishing them, whereas others think it's about, community cohesion, and that people who are homeless are just as much a citizen as everybody else. So yes, there is a lot of training needed. And I think our approach to this is to sort of really highlight the good stuff and celebrate it, try and spread it, rather than, I guess, accuse people of being, the worst end of the spectrum all of the time, because what we find is that doesn't necessarily win people over.
Yeah, I'd like to meet this Warren. I might go his contact details off you.
Yeah, definitely.
That's quite an interesting fact, because I know in my early days, I knew nothing about private property. And I was on that doorstep and a policeman came. It was pissing down with rain that night. Yeah. And all he said to me was, "If you don't go, I'm going to arrest you when I come back." He never came back. And the following morning, I'm sitting on that doorstep having a cigarette. A police car appeared. I thought they were coming here to arrest me. And I said to the guy, "What happened?" He said he had no right to do it. So there is that, what you said, bullying from some policemen. And other policemen are very friendly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I sort of, I've heard lots and lots of people like you basically saying that actually what they would do when they're threatened like that is they move further and further out. And quite often what that does is it puts people out of the range or the information that's available to outreach teams. So you find that people are kind of, because of police behaviour, they're less likely to know about or be found by the services that they need, which is all totally counterproductive. And, you know, just imagine that instead what the police are doing is saying, you know, right, nice to see you. Really, really good that we've met. Here's what I know about the support that's available to you. Is there any help you need? You know?
Yeah, you're interesting. I was going to tell you another story and see your opinion. I was with Kabul Citizens St Albans. They were doing a project, a part of a festival called Squat. They were working with the homeless people, and they had a night shelter there, which was luxury to me. It was 12 rooms, but still they had the rule, 28 nights. Okay, but they did have street homelessness as well. We got one of the guys to take us around so we could talk to them. And then on the night of the show, they took me along. I was only there the first day and the last night of the show. They took me along really to talk to people. And I ended up talking to the head of housing. And he said to me, I said to him, one of my little things is empty properties. That's a personal thing because I can't see the point of them. And I said, what are you doing empty? Oh, yeah, we co-opt it. We change into families. I said, but what about single people? And he turned around to me and blazingly said, we don't have any single homeless in this town. And St Albans, for your information, you might not know it well, the rent is the same as London. It's only an hour away from London. Would you say there has to be an education among those people?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think sometimes when you look at local authority data, what you see is that when it's published, it's not a reflection of the demand for services, it's a reflection of the amount that they can supply. And what I mean by that is it's sort of, you know, you sometimes think when you know a local area, hang on a second, that's not, you know, that doesn't reflect the level of particularly non-priority homelessness. You're just telling the world how many people you've helped. And I think when people get too hung up on the kind of on their own story at a local level about what's been done, and you can get really weird things happening. Like I was up in Newcastle, which is a place that's now basically declared that you know, rough sleeping is over, that there's no need, you know, because there's no need for people to sleep rough in the language they use, that somehow it doesn't exist. So yes, education's needed. I think it's always been the case that the only way of truly dealing with this problem is to admit its full nature, to admit its full prevalence, and to ask people to explain that to you. Because if you just do it by a kind of internal story about who's been helped, then you can really warp those things. And just because you said it, I need to respond to it. The thing about time limiting stays in accommodation like that is such a disaster. It really is such a disaster. And in loads, because you know, this is often down to what local authorities themselves choose to do as their policies. But the idea of saying I see it all the time, you know, the maximum hostel stay in this town is 6 months, and, you know, out you go afterwards. Or, you know, the maximum stay in a kind of no second night out hub is 7 days or something. And then you think, if you haven't got the services that people need, why are you intentionally making people's lives worse? I just don't understand it. And you get used to this sort of brutality that's in the system, where it says, well, we haven't got enough to go around, so we've just got to live with the consequences, you know, rather than saying, no, this isn't good enough. We need to make the argument for the sufficient amount of help that's needed. Yeah,
the 28 night. Actually, I was at a GLA meeting about housing and homeless, how they were going to approach it. The idea came up this is several years ago, but must be 4 or 5 years ago. And all the professionals said 28 nights is not enough to deal with a client. Yeah. Have you we're coming towards the end, because I've only got a limited time with you, but thank you very much for coming. Have you got any other things that are happening with crime? Any other schemes or proposals you're making through crisis?
I mean, the main thing, I think the main thing, Ian, is that this idea of shifting from managing to ending homelessness is starting to take hold, particularly in Scotland and Wales. And, sometimes you can feel in this job that everything's against you. Like you spend your time having to stop the recriminalisation of begging and things like that. You think, oh God, but actually, if you take a slightly longer view of this, the lines are shifting. There's something in the water here about how actually there are more and more kind of schemes that are about getting people directly into their own home. We're running a couple, for example, for prison leavers, so that people don't have to spend months in hostels and night shelters. So really the big thing for me is how we get mainstream housing seen as the answer to homelessness, and away from this idea that there's a cohort of people who deserve really not much more than some 28 nights in St Albans.
Thank you very much, Matt. I've really enjoyed. We do talk about other things, mainly football, the important things of life. But this is very interesting. I'm sure my viewers, if anybody has any comments on it, please email me at binofwords@writeme. That's WRITEME.com. And thank you. And I'll speak to you